Hi everyone. Nisreen and Khalid, you guys did a great job. Loved learning about what you presented. I'm Hasheemah. This is actually my second time giving an afikra forward. And today I'm gonna talk to you guys about this book I read called Midnight in Cairo, The Divas of Egypt's Roaring 20s by Raphael Cormack. Oops, there we go. So this is one of many covers of the book, and that is the author. He has a PhD in Egyptian theater, which is kind of what led him to write this book. That was published in 2021. So the events that are being told in this book happened 100 and some years ago. And it's very interesting to kind of look at the 20s that we're all in and compare it with the 20s that they were all in. And the book, the way the author has the book divided is in 3 acts. And so the first one takes us into Cairo in the late 19th century, early 20th. Then he has a second act that chronicles the lives of 7 women, which I'll kind of give you guys like brief snippets of these women in this presentation, the parts that I found interesting as they were told through the author's research. And then the last part kind of dives into, the last part of the book dives into World War II and essentially the end of Cairo's nightlife as it was known back then in those 20s. So the author takes us here to a place called Izbakia Gardens, specifically a street named Imad al-Din Street, and which was known as the center of nightlife. So the restaurants, bars, cafes, cabarets, theaters, all were happening on this one street called Imad al-Din Street. And it was just this long street with like a streetcar line going and coming. And it was a place where not only local Egyptians were kind of mingling and just enjoying the nightlife, but there were a lot of Europeans there as well as a result of World War I and colonialism. And so I'm gonna give you guys some snippets on these women. The first woman he chronicles is Rosa Yousef, who is known as one of the greatest actresses of that time. And a similarity between her and the other 6 women that I'll mention and that were mentioned in the book is that we don't know much about their early life. There's not much out there other than we know that, for example, Rose came from a poor household, and we don't really know how she ended up in Cairo. We know that she was in Lebanon, and then all of a sudden she was in Argentina, and then somehow somewhere ends up in Cairo as a teen. And that's another commonality with these women, is that they end up on the stage as teenagers. But she is successful, becomes one of the greatest actresses of that time. And one day she's sitting, and picture this, she's sitting outside cafe with her friends, and this guy passes by. She buys a magazine from him. That's your modern day mailman, but just picture 100 years ago what that might have looked like. And she's sifting through this magazine, and she's essentially saying, this has no substance. There's a lot of gossip on her performances, other people's performances. There's not true criticism of theater, and she wanted to change that. And so she got her friends together, her second husband and different writers and journalists, and started her own magazine called Rosa Yousef. She named it after herself, rightfully so. And she ends up editing it she was the editor for it for 25 years. And what you'll see is that this magazine also chronicled Cairo's nightlife. It was known as, the main chronicler of that nightlife, but it also chronicled the 6 women that I will speak to in a moment as well. And she ends up handing over the reins after 25 years to her son. The magazine is still in print today. So I wonder if she imagined that was going to be the case. But another commonality with her and the women that you'll see is that she kind of, at the end of it, fades from the spotlight, and one day she's watching a movie at a theater, has a heart attack, goes home, and dies that day. And that's the end of Rose's story as we know it. The next person is Fatma Razzaq. She's an actress turned filmmaker. Again, we don't know much about her early life. She's a teenager. This guy who was an actor / director took her under his wing. They eventually get married, although there's some underlying questionable sort of questions around that relationship, given the power dynamics and the enormous age difference. But nonetheless, she becomes a famous actor. And I thought what was funny about this story, what was interesting about this story to me, was that actually her first performance wasn't as successful, or maybe it was. So she's up on stage and she's up on stage, and apparently the performance was so real that she ran off into her mother's hands, and then her mother started yelling at the director, and it all seemed like it was real. And the guy was kind of like, you guys, this is just theater. And so I thought that was very fascinating. And again, she also kind of fades away from the spotlight. And at the end of her life, it's said that she was actually begging for money. And one of her last interviews, which is a common thing that I noticed in these women, is one of her last interviews, she essentially said, you know, she didn't want to be forgotten. And that was something that was common amongst the women, is that they all said that they didn't want to be forgotten. And I mean, I'm talking about them now, so I guess they haven't been. The next person is Fatma Sirri, so another Fatma. She's a singer. She becomes a famous singer. And this all happens by a series of phone calls, actually 2 phone calls. The first one is from Huda Sha'rawi's friend, who called the Huda Sha'rawi, the feminist, who calls her and says, hey, we want you to perform at Huda Sha'rawi's party on this so-and-so day. So she goes, she ends up meeting Huda Sha'rawi's son, Hamad Sha'rawi. They end up falling in love, getting married, having a kid, all under the pretenses of urfi, so it wasn't registered by the state, I guess civilly. And so they're tied up in lawsuits, and she ends up taking them to court, and for 6 years, because he wasn't supporting her child. And Huda Sha'rawi, being the feminist that she was also, as the book termed it, a product of her class. And so she looked down on women like Fatima, like a singer. What are you doing being a singer, essentially? But 6 years into lawsuits, and Fatma Sirri wins the case. And the case was so famous at the time that they made a movie out of it, and Kalthoum was the star of that movie. Which brings us to Kalthoum and another person along her side named Mounira al-Mahdiyya, and they sort of pop up in the same sort of years. And the way these magazines, including Rosa Yousef's magazine, kind of pit them against each other for the stark differences. You have Kalthoum, who's very much an introvert, as they describe her, but then you have somebody like Mounira, who's very much an extrovert and out there. And there was a lot of, sabotage and gossip and all of that. But at the end of the day, Kalthoum's funeral was, known as one of the biggest events of the 20th century in Egypt, with the numerous people that have attended. But when Mounira al-Mahdiyya passed away, there were only 7 people at her funeral, and her career, as opposed to Kalthoum's career, where she kept going, Mounira was dabbling between singing and theater, and where she wasn't finding success in singing, she would go to theater, and vice versa, till she eventually just called it, that's it, I'm retiring. Another person that was mentioned was Azeez Ahmed. She was an actress and played in 2 different movies, Layla and Daughter of the Nile, which were famous at the time, still play around, still are being played. And then the last person the book chronicled was a person named Badia Masabni, and she was originally from Damascus. And she also had a lot of deception around her career and a lot of questions, but she eventually opens up this huge casino on the Nile, to whom apparently when Edward Said was a 14-year-old boy, he snuck into the casino to watch another performer perform, which I thought was very interesting, picturing a young Edward Said, a boy, essentially. And she was so famous that it's said that in May 1940, Rosa Yousef, the magazine, chronicled that Adolf Hitler himself actually sentenced her to death in absentia for criticizing the Nazis in one of her performances. So yeah, that's how far her performances went. And so those, what I just told you, were just snippets that I found interesting about their stories. There's many more out there, and there's many more in the book itself, as told by the author. But if you're interested, these are other books as well. I have yet to read them, so disclaimer. But these are some books that chronicle these women and others as well of that time. Thank you.